Once upon a time, in a magical kingdom, not as far away from here as you may think, there was a town called Devasia. Devasia was a wonderful town, surrounded by forests and a huge mountain stretching along the one side. In this town lived a man named George, although his name could have been anything, because nobody knew it. You see, George was what you would call a nobody. He walked around town, he did his job, and he lived his life, but nobody really knew him. In a similar way, he didn't really know them. George did know one thing though. He wanted to be a knight in the king's army. Ever since last week, when he went to watch the jousting tournament, George had known that was the life for him. How the crowds had cheered as the brave knights rode their horses towards each other gallantly. How the noise of the hooves pounding on the floor and the sound of iron clashing in the air had echoed through the air and around the arena and entered his ears as if the sounds were filling his head with ideas and dreams. One day, as George wandered around town with his head full of dreams, he looked up to realise he'd taken a wrong turn. In the distance, he saw a strange-looking building that he'd never noticed before. Indeed, this part of town was unknown to him completely, and he wondered how he'd even gotten here. George walked towards this strange building, intrigued by what it may be. As he approached, a man rode out from the building on top of a great white horse. The horse had magnificent cloth draped over its back with glistening jewels shining in the sunlight. George looked up at the man riding this wonderful beast and saw him giving a friendly wave and a warm smile. "Excuse me," said George to the man, "but may I ask what this place is?" "This is what I like to call Night School," said the man with a loud and jovial laugh. George gave the man a puzzled look and asked what he meant. "It's where we train people to be knights," he said. "My name is Sir Belzium. You've no doubt heard of me." George had indeed heard of Sir Belzium. Who hadn't? Sir Belzium ran one of the best-known knight training schools in the whole of Devasia. His knights had gone on to win countless jousts, and his reputation as a knight trainer was envied for miles around. "That's what I want to do one day," said George. "I want to be a knight." Sir Belzium smiled and said, "Oh, really? Think you've got what it takes, eh? Well, they all do. They all think it's easy. Just sit on a horse, holding a stick, and you get rich quick. Pah!" George looked shocked and replied, "I know it's not easy. I don't mind that. I just want to be someone." Sir Belzium changed his expression as he looked at George to one with more seriousness and concern, said, "Then someone you will be." Over the next few years, George spent a lot of his time training to be a knight. He trained longer and harder than anyone ever had before. He sacrificed everything to become the best he could, training 7 days a week for years, until one day he felt ready to enter a tournament. When the day of the tournament arrived, George felt excited. He'd spent a long time becoming the best knight Sir Belzium had ever trained. George's skill was unmatched by anyone at the training school. Even Sir Belzium himself secretly feared George, for he knew that he couldn't beat him in a battle if it came to it. As George expected, he won the tournament easily. He rode his horse around the jousting arena, holding his lance high in the air to the cheers and cries of the crowd. This is what George had wanted for years, and now, after all his training, he had it. As time passed, George won more and more tournaments. He became famous across the land as more and more people heard of his tales and adventures and people travelled from far and wide to watch him taking part in the jousting tournaments. Eventually, George was noticed by the king of Devasia, who decided to honour him for his efforts. From that day on, George was known to everyone as Sir George. These triumphs were not without their costs, however. George's life had become nothing but work, work, work. And after a while he found that even winning a tournament and the thrill of the crowds cheering became a little boring. It was one day when he was out riding his horse around the edge of the town that he came across a small path leading at the side of the mountain. He'd never noticed this path before and wanted to see where it led, so he pulled on the reins of his mighty horse, which answered his call by galloping along the path. As Sir George reached the top of the mountain, he looked down and could see the whole of Devasia from one side to the other. His gaze slipped to the east of Devasia, where in the distance he could see some black trees at the very edge of the forest. As he glanced west, he saw another town. In all his time in Devasia, he'd never once thought about what was on the other side of the grey mountain. Nobody had ever mentioned another town. In fact, nobody had ever dared venture up the mountain. Curious to see what this town was like, he yanked the reins of the horse once more. This time the horse was a little resistant and neighed as if to ask Sir George if he was sure. With another pull on the reins, the horse bounded down along the path leading down to this new town. Sir George knew something was very different as soon as he rode into the town. The houses were all painted bright blue, and every one of them had a yellow door. People were walking along the street, but every now and then they would hop into the air before they continued walking. How odd, thought Sir George as he continued to ride on. He came across a man standing by the side of a building and asked him where he was. "This is Enchantia," said the man. "Now you know who we are, may I ask who you are?" Sir George was outraged. "Why, I'm the mighty Sir George, of course." The man gave him a funny look and said, "Never heard of you, sorry." "Peasants," thought Sir George. "How can anyone not have heard of me? My brave deeds are known all over the kingdom." Sir George rode on, further into the town, until he found a tavern. He strode in boldly, ready for the usual rush of people wanting to hear his tales of victory and bravery, yet as he opened the door and walked to the bar, nobody in the tavern even noticed him. He ordered his favourite drink, and the barman said, "2 pieces of silver, please." "Pardon," said Sir George, "you expect me to pay for my drink?" "I certainly do," said the barman, "and before you think of causing any trouble, you might want to know that the old man's sitting there in the corner." Sir George looked and saw there was indeed an old man sitting in the corner, quietly sipping drink from his mug. Sir George laughed to himself and wondered what he had to fear from an old man. "There you go," Sir George said as he slapped down 2 silver coins on the bar in disgust. Not in years had Sir George ever had to pay for a drink. The cheek of it! These people had no idea who he was. Had they never been out to this tiny town? As Sir George drank, he noticed the old man watching him closely. "Do you have a problem with me, old man?" he called out. The old man just kept looking at him as though he hadn't heard a word. Sir George felt most uncomfortable here and decided to head home. He left the tavern and rode his grey horse back over the mountain towards his hometown, where he was once again, as usual, met with cheers from his many admirers. It felt great to be back, but as Sir George lay in his bed that night, he couldn't get the image of that old man out of his head. Why had he been looking at him like that? Why had he felt so different in that town to how he normally does? He resolved to get a good night's sleep and head back for Enchantia in the morning. The next day, as Sir George prepared to head back over the mountain, he remembered those black trees he'd seen in the distance. He called out to a passer-by to see if they knew anything about it. "I say," said Sir George, "have you ever noticed those black trees at the edge of the forest? Do you know what's causing it?" "Indeed we have noticed, Sir George," said the peasant. "Some say it's a new kind of disease that's taken over. Word is it's already destroyed a town miles away from here, and it's heading our way." "Pah," thought George, "no disease could ever destroy Devasia." It reminded him of the time he visited one of those crazy fortune tellers at a fair. They told him that one day horses wouldn't be used anymore. The fortune teller had looked into a crystal ball and told him that she could see the future, and that in this future, instead of riding horses, men would ride around in metal contraptions by pushing levers and turning wheels. As if that wasn't crazy enough, women would be driving these devices as well. Thought Sir George, whoever could imagine such a stupid thing? He rode off back towards the mountain and found the same little pathway that he had followed the day before. As he reached the top of the mountain, he took another look at the dark black trees he had seen previously. They looked just the same, lurking menacingly in the distance. Sir George continued along the mountain and rode back down into Enchantia. As he rode the streets, he noticed the old man that he had seen in the tavern the day before. The old man was dressed most oddly, wearing purple clothes and a purple pointy hat. Sir George had to try not to laugh, and thought the man must be going to some kind of party. "Old man," said Sir George, "who are you, and why are you dressed so strangely? Why were you staring at me that time in the tavern? Why have I never heard of this place before?" The old man slowly moved his eyes to meet Sir George's gaze. He took his time answering. "You have many questions, but you already had the answers before the question," said the old man. "What are you talking about?" said Sir George. "Stop talking in riddles and answer me. What is this strange place?" The old man answered with, "You think yourself brave, but I wonder if you'd be brave enough to step inside my humble home." Sir George leapt off his horse heroically, tied the horse to a wooden post, and walked up to the old man. "Of course I am," he snapped. The old man asked Sir George, "Why are you here?" To which Sir George replied, "I'm looking to see what's out there. I think I've seen all there is to see, and I've done all there is to do, and quite frankly, I'm bored. If you must know, I'm thinking of moving here to brighten up this dull little town." "And what would you do here?" asked the old man. "Why, I'm Sir George, don't you know me? I'm the finest horseman in the kingdom. I can joust, I can fight, and I can teach others to do the same. I've trained hundreds, nay, thousands of knights." The old man slowly shook his head as he said, "I'm sorry, sir, but we have no need for any of those services here. As you can see, we're a peaceful place where there is no fighting, and no need for gallant knights. I'm afraid you may not survive here." "May not survive?" roared Sir George. "Why, I've faced the most fierce battles ever encountered. I've jousted with the best knights in the world, and have never lost a single time. If anyone can survive, it's me." The old man chuckled to himself and replied, "Can you imagine a world where there was no need for fighting, no need for knights or competitions, maybe even no need for horses, other than seeing them graze in the fields?" Sir George did actually know what the old man meant. You see, although his fans and followers thought of Sir George as this brave, fearless knight that had inspired so many. The truth was that inside he had secretly become bored of the fighting long ago. What used to give him so much fun bored him now, and he longed for a life where he could help people instead of hurting them. As George thought for a moment, the old man said, "If you do want a way out, then I have an idea. You know, we are who we choose to be. You were not born a knight, and you don't have to die a knight." Sir George replied, "True, but if not a knight, I know not what else I could be." The old man thought for a moment before asking Sir George if he'd like to become something quite special indeed. Someone that others would look upon and respect and be fascinated by. A bit like how life is now, but without the fighting and anger, said the old man. Sir George was starting to think this man was maybe a bit mad, but he didn't want to offend him. "Go on then," said Sir George. "What is this thing I can do that will change everything?" "I could tell you, but I'd rather show you," said the old man. "If you're brave enough, that is." "Do your worst, old man," said Sir George. The old man spoke in a quizzical way. "Do you remember the first time we met and I didn't know your name? Are you aware of the fact that you don't yet know my name? Well, I bet I can make it so that you can't remember your own name." "Ridiculous," snorted Sir George. "My name has been with me all my life. It's George. See, I do remember it. It's George." Yes, so it is," said the old man. "But I haven't done it yet." "Done what?" asked Sir George. "Follow these instructions and you'll see," replied the old man. Sir George did just what the old man had said. He closed his eyes, and a few seconds later he opened them after listening to the old man mumbling on about something. "I'm sorry," said the old man as he looked at Sir George. "I'm getting a little forgetful in my old age. Could you just remind me what your name is, please?" "I'm right," thought Sir George. "He's mad." Sir George replied with, "My name is—" But no matter how hard he tried, he just could not remember his name. It was right there, on the tip of his tongue, but he just could not remember it. "Sorry," said the old man, "but I think I'm also going a bit deaf. Could you repeat that for me, please?" Sir George just could not remember his name. The old man saw a look of panic over Sir George's face and clicked his fingers. "My name is George. Why, it's George. What just happened?" The old man laughed and said, "Just a little something we all used to know a long time ago, but many of us have forgotten. It's what you might call magic." "Are you sure your name's George? I thought it was Sir George." George smiled to himself as he tried to work out what had just happened. "How did you do that, old man?" "As I said, just a little magic," said the old man. "Trouble is, nobody believes in magic anymore, you see. It's all horses, fighting and building castles these days." "I want to know how you did that," said George. "Are you sure?" asked the old man. "Lots of people say that, but when it comes to it, they don't really want to know. It scares a lot of people. But you're not a lot of people, are you? And you're not scared, are you? Have a think about it, and if you want to live here and learn my magic, then you know where to find me." George rode back home with more questions in his head than answers. As he paused atop the mountain, he saw those black trees in the distance. Was it his imagination, or had the blackness crept a few rows of trees closer than last time he had looked? George rode home and spent the next few weeks thinking about what had happened with the old man. He rode to the jousting practice grounds one day and noticed some new knights there. each one boasting about how great they were and how they were the next big thing. George yawned and sighed before chuckling to himself. He knew better, and he was going to show them a thing or two. At the next tournament, George would show these new pretenders how he'd taken his life to another level. As the tournament began, he faced off against one of the new knights. As the horses faced each other and started running ever closer together, George used some of his magic that he learnt from the old man. Instead of getting anywhere near hitting him, the other knight threw his lance to the ground and put his hands on his hips, presenting his whole body as an easy target for George. The new knight went flying off the horse and the crowd burst into laughter. "That new knight's lost his marbles," they jeered. The knight stood up from the ground and had no idea what had just happened. Why had he thrown his lance to the ground? He was all ready to take over from Sir George as being the next big thing, and instead he looked like a complete fool. He hadn't got a clue what had happened, but George had. The next knight positioned himself at the end of the arena, ready to gallop boldly towards George. As he did so, he too threw his lance to the ground, performed a handstand on the back of his horse, and opened his legs wide open. As George planted his lance squarely in the knight's crotch, the crowd roared even louder than before at this ridiculous sight. The knight fell off his horse and landed with his head wedged in a bucket of water that was meant for his horse. Oh, how the crowds laughed and cried at the triumphant return of their favourite knight. As George rode around the arena, he spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was the old man. The old man smiled to himself, pleased that George had learned so well and was showing his skill to so many, even though they didn't know it. George turned back to face the remaining competitors. "Look at these fools," he thought. "I was doing all this years ago, and here they are thinking they know it all. They'll learn, or even worse, maybe they won't, and they'll be stuck like this forever. I know there's more to life than riding horses, and they seem to think it's all there is." George decided to pack up some of his things and go and visit the old man to learn even more of his magic. He knew he'd learned something already, but there was so much more. George spent many months and years visiting the old man in Enchantia. People back in Devasia kept asking where he was, and where was he going all the time. How come he hadn't been around for months? Why wasn't he showing off anymore in tournaments? Why weren't they seeing him anymore? They just didn't know that George had bigger fish to fry. As George approached the end of his training, the old man let him in on a secret that would change George's life forever. "You've done well, George, and you've listened to all I've taught you. Now I'm going to tell you something that you may already know, but may not realise. The world is changing. That black forest you've been seeing from atop the mountain isn't just in your imagination. It's real, and it's getting closer each day. The people of Devasia won't admit it, but their days are numbered. For years, even decades now, they've had a great life. But some people just can't see what's coming until it's too late. You're different. You're wise. And your eyes are open, even when they're closed. I fear it won't be long until Devasia is no more." "But what about Enchantia?" asked George. "Oh, Enchantia's safe," said the old man. "How come?" said George. "Our magic." The old man then went on. "You've learnt a great power here, George. Before, you had the power to entertain, but now you have the power to change the world. It was fun watching you use your magic at the jousting tournament, but you must know that there are far more uses you can put it to. Just think of all the lives you can change and all the happiness you could bring with this gift that I've given you, this gift that you've learned." The old man was right. George had learnt a lot from him, and he had made him realise how wrong he'd been about so much in his life. Even during his time as a knight, he had been doing so many things the wrong way. Yes, he had the techniques and the skills to be a great knight, but he often hadn't understood exactly how and why what he did worked. When he was training new knights himself, he would often just come across people who did things he couldn't understand, people that did things that seemed crazy to him. He'd sometimes write them off as lost causes or think they were just hopeless. Now he realised where he'd gone wrong and kicked himself for it. And to make it worse, what about those new knights? They were the same as he'd been. They thought they knew it all after a few years of training and a brief glimpse of success. But they were totally missing the point. George also thought about the knights that he'd just trained to ride, and he thought about whether or not he'd done a good thing, or whether it was actually a bad thing. All these poor knights that were out there riding their horses, all because of him, and now here he was, realising how bad a thing this was to be doing. George knew he had a tough decision to make. He went home and gave it some serious thought for several months, until he decided at last what to do with his life. Now as the months roll by, we now come to George's favourite time of the year, Christmas. George vowed that he was going to make this choice and announced it to his people. The time for mystery and secrets was over. George had the skill, knowledge and power to change the world. George went to gather all of his possessions and realised how little he had in life. Despite his skill and popularity, his possessions were few. He travelled up the mountain and looked all around over the kingdom and thought about his life. He saw Devasia and all of his people going about their lives and their daily business just like they always did. He saw comfort and familiarity, but in the blink of an eye and a slight shift to the side, he saw the black forest growing ever nearer. He saw Enchantia and its seemingly boundless lands stretching for miles around, protected by its magic. He thought about all he'd learned from Sir Belzium and the old man. He thought about all of his time jousting and pleasing the crowds. As George stood on top of the mountain, a man approached him. "Excuse me, sir," said the man. "I'm on my way to a place called Devasia. I wonder if you could tell me what it's like," said the stranger. "Where have you come from?" asked George. "A place called Norwood," said the stranger. "And what's it like there?" asked George. The stranger looked down at his feet and spoke in a low, depressing voice. "Oh, it's terrible. Everyone is so angry all the time. It's so loud and there's so much crime. I never feel happy at all." "Well, I'm sure you'll find Devasia just the same," said George. The stranger sighed and murmured, "Oh well, thanks anyway," as he shuffled off towards Devasia. A short time later, as George was travelling along the mountain, another stranger happened upon him. "Excuse me, sir," said the stranger. "I'm on my way to a place called Devasia. I wonder if you could tell me what it's like." "Where have you come from?" asked George. "A place called Norwood," said the stranger. "And what's it like there?" asked George. The stranger smiled and said in a voice full of hope and promise, "Oh, it's a wonderful place. The people are so friendly. It's always quiet there, and there's never any trouble. I always feel happy whenever I'm there." "Well, I'm sure you'll find Devasia just the same," said George. "Wonderful!" exclaimed the stranger as he set off with a spring in his step. George took one last look around him as he contemplated all he'd learnt in his life. After a few minutes, as a warm smile grew on his face, he took a deep breath, pulled on the reins of his horse, and journeyed down the mountain. All around your chest, just relaxing. Just let your muscles just fall away, nice and gentle, nice and soft. You're almost like you're lying on a beach in the sun on a holiday, no cares in the world at all. All down your arms, your biceps, all past your elbows, just feeling really calm and relaxed all over. No stress, no tension, no expectation to do anything. All the way down to your hands, your wrists, your fingers, all feeling calm and all loose and limp and lazy, relaxed. And that wave of energy continues down through your stomach, all around your waist, taking away any tensions that you feel whatsoever. All around the tops of your legs, your thighs, all down to your knees, all feeling calm and relaxed. Then all down past your knees, through your shins, to your ankles, and the end of your toes.